greater increase in presidential hazard rates than parliamentary. Again, I'll turn to the comparative evidence here. So I'll keep this part brief. I can certainly talk a lot more about the evidence in the Q&A. But let me just give you a sense of the data I've used to look at this question. Right. So my data looks at all electorally contested regimes, so both democracies and electoral autocracies such as Singapore or Malaysia from 1950 until 2006. That produces a total of 159 regimes, 142 states, and almost 700 distinct periods of ruling party control. Right. Let me just give you an idea of how the dependent variable is coded. So I have each case is a duration of incumbent rule. Right. And by incumbent, I mean incumbent ruling party. So as a concrete illustration, from the US, we have actually 4 periods of incumbent control here. So Nixon and Ford make up a Republican period of 8 years. Then we have Ford defeated, 4-year period of Democratic control, 12-year period of Republican control, and 8 years of Democratic control. So 8, 4, 12, 8 for 4 total parties. And what we're trying to explain then is why we get 8, 4, 12, and 8. So I've run an analysis on this. I won't show you too much of I won't show you the figures. What I want to call your attention to is 2 things that I'm really focused on here. One is the difference between presidential and parliamentary, and the other is a measure of electoral advantage. So I look at the vote share difference between the incumbent party and the next party in the lower house elections that's closest to when they came to power. Okay. So, yeah, before I jump into this, let me say, I have some figures some numbers that I could show you from the regression coefficients, but it's easier to present this result graphically, and so I'm just going to show you several graphs that kind of demonstrate how things move under different conditions. Right. So the first graph is, here is a weak ruling party. This is at a low level of electoral advantage. This is actually 2 standard deviations below the mean. And what you see here is that the dark line here, the solid line, is parliamentary hazard rates. The way to read this is, at any given time, here's your expected probability of losing at that time. So why is there a spike here? This is somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 to 5 years. A lot of ruling parties actually come up for re-election right at that time, and so we shouldn't actually be surprised that we see a spike in both regime types. In fact, what this is showing us is that at low levels of electoral advantage, early on at least, it's better to be in a presidential regime because the hazard rate is lower than a parliamentary regime. As we go towards the mean, though, this shifts. Right, so here's the mean values of everything. At 10 years out, it's significantly worse to be in a presidential regime. At 20 years out, it's double. The hazard rate is double. So you are
for the incumbent party.
For the incumbent party, that's right. For twice. So 20 years out, you are twice as likely to lose in a presidential regime as in a parliamentary. And if we go at a level of high electoral advantage, this is more like the KMT picture. We have a we have a significantly higher rate of defeat, so significantly higher hazard rates in presidential than in parliamentary. Okay? So this difference continues to expand. So in plain English, the implications of this are that, number one, presidentialism does have the surprising effect of better ensuring regular partisan rotation of the executive, particularly when you have one party that is advantaged over all others in the political system. The second, and more pertinent to us today, is that the causes of defeat of longtime dominant parties may differ across executive types. And in particular, when we think about dominant party defeat, presidential defeats may be due actually mostly to chance, whereas parliamentary defeats are more likely to indicate some fundamental erosion of the incumbent's electoral advantage. So that's the comparative part of the analysis. I'm now going to take that evidence and move back and kind of cast a spotlight again on the Taiwan case and think a little more about what this means for Taiwan and how we understand Taiwanese politics. So first off, having absorbed everything I've just said, let's think through again what happened in the 2000 election. And the stuff that occurs here starts to look a little more important and systematically important. So first off, we have a term-limited incumbent, Lee Deng-hui, who does not run and thus sets off a succession fight. Now, many of you probably know better than I do what the political climate was in the late 90s, but my guess is Lee Deng-hui probably would have been comfortably re-elected if he'd run for a third term. Right? And so the KMT loses in part because they don't have Lee Deng-hui on the ticket. Second, Lian Jian is the winner of the succession battle, and then we have this independent Song leave the party and run. Again, that happens right in the run-up to the 2000 presidential election. And so this is a particularly bad time to have a split in the party. There's an interesting contrast with the Xindang, the new party in 1994, when they leave. There's no presidential election right in that time period, and so by the time 1996 rolls around, that split is less damaging to the party's fortunes. Third, Chen Shui-bian has wide crossover appeal. He's kind of like Ike here, right? We have this candidate who brings a lot to the table from his own personal story and characteristics that his party cannot. Right, so he's increasing the value of his ticket simply because of who he is. And then finally, we have a minority winner here as well. The DPP wins this election with less than 40% of the vote. All four of these things would be unlikely to happen in a parliamentary regime. So all four of these things are dependent on the fact that this is a presidential election that ends KMT rule. So it's fun to think a little bit about the counterfactual here in some more detail about what if Taiwan really had been parliamentary. If we look at the legislative vote share, this is from 1986, and I'm just taking the supplementary seats in 86 and 89 and looking at the seat share that both parties won, and then plotting all the parties that won seats through the 2012 election. As of 1998, the KMT is still doing quite well in the legislative elections. They're at almost 55% of the seats. The nearest opponent, the DPP, is at a little over 30%. And it's only in 2001 that we get this kind of eruption of the party system. Now, there's good reason to expect this wouldn't have happened had the KMT won the 2000 election. But because the KMT is knocked out of power, I think there's part of the resource story that makes sense here, that you get people fleeing the party in part because they see it as no longer as effective or no longer as certain a winning ticket as it did before. And so this is kind of a worst case scenario for the KMT. So I'd like to zoom in on these numbers and look at seat share even under these very inauspicious conditions. Right? What kind of coalition would you be likely to see in the 2001 legislature after this election? Well, the KMT is not the leading party, but the PFP is James Song's party. Right? So these two parties together are likely to team up because they're ideologically similar. They're both from a KMT background. The new party is certainly, and people have focused on Taiwan's single non-transferable vote system at the expense of this much more fundamental difference between presidential and parliamentary. And in fact, people have compared SNTV from across, say, Taiwan and Japan, even though these are two fundamentally different executive types. And so the electoral system, I think, has featured too prominently in these stories at the expense of the executive story that I'm telling here. And second, there is a clear KMT, or at least a clear pan-blue electoral advantage that really has never disappeared over this entire time period. So 2000 was an upset. 2004, in some sense, was an upset as well.
And then it got much worse with the new electoral system.
Yeah, right? So we got much more disproportionality. And so if we look, rather than seat share, if we look at vote share, you can see this effect pretty strongly. So I'm taking out the disproportionality to some extent. I should be cautious. These are taken from the PR vote. So the 部分区, for those of you who speak Taiwanese. I'm just looking at legislative vote shares. And what this shows is that about the closest the DPP has ever come to parity is actually in the 2004 legislative election, or at least the pan-green camp as a whole has come to parity. And in fact, we've actually got a widening of this difference over the last 8 years. So there still is a clear KMT or pan-blue advantage. But, and this is the point I want to leave you with today, that doesn't mean the KMT is a prohibitive favorite to win in 2016. So the last thing I'd like to do is handicap, make some predictions about the 2016 election. There's a couple things to think about. One is that the KMT and its allies have always retained control of the legislature, so they're probably likely to do that in 2016 as well, unless something fundamental changes. The current president was re-elected 52-46, but in 2016 he is term limited out of office, just like Lee Teng-hui. And we know from 20 years of experience that the KMT has traditionally had a really hard time nominating candidates for executive races, not just the presidency, but for mayor's races, for county executives, 县长, 市长, right? The KMT has had consistently a lot of trouble in settling on one nominee and keeping renegade candidates, little Songchuyus, from running in these races as well. And so, unless the party solves this problem definitively in 2016, I think there's a good possibility you may see an intra-party fight that results in a split again. There's a long history of this in the party, and so we may end up having another DPP president who wins with a minority of votes. So, with that, I will conclude the formal part.